Welcome back, deep divers. Ready to dive into something new today?
Always.
Excellent. I love that enthusiasm. Today, we're tackling the science of decision making. We all make them, right?
Right.
Little decisions like, what am I going to eat?
Yeah.
Big ones. Should I take that new job? How do we make those choices? What's happening in our brains when we do?
Well, a lot of times we like to think that we're being, completely logical.
Yeah.
But there's really a lot happening behind the scenes, I would say.
I think that's a great way to put it. And to help us understand those inner workings, you've brought some fascinating research with you.
Yes.
One of the papers you shared is called Bridging the Gap Between Science and Decision Making. That's a pretty big gap to bridge.
It is a big gap, yeah.
So where should we start with this?
Well, this paper argues that all decisions are based on two main things.
Okay.
Our beliefs and our values.
Beliefs and values. Yeah.
It's almost like, when you're building a house.
I do like where this is going. Okay, so how do beliefs and values work, like building a house?
Well, let's say you're trying to decide whether to accept a new job offer.
Okay.
Okay. Your beliefs, those are like the foundation of the house.
Okay.
That's what you think is true about the job. Is
Yeah.
the company reliable? Am I going to enjoy this work? You base these beliefs on, the information you have, the job description, what you hear from other people, the research that you do.
So it's gathering the building materials and making sure that they're strong enough to support the house.
Yeah, exactly.
But a house is more than just foundation, right?
Exactly. That's where your values come in.
Okay.
And values are like the blueprint for your house.
I like that.
They determine what kind of house you want to build, what matters most to you in a job. Is it a high salary? Is it flexible hours? Interesting projects?
Yeah.
Your values help you to weigh the pros and cons based on what is important to you.
So beliefs are the facts, values are the priorities.
Yes, exactly.
Interesting. But how do we use science to actually make better decisions? How do we get better at making these choices?
Yeah, well, the paper gives a great example of how science can inform our beliefs.
Okay.
And this example involves a doctor recommending a medical procedure to turn a breech baby. So just imagine you're in that situation.
Yeah.
You want to make the best possible decision for your child's health.
Absolutely. That's a huge decision for any parent to make.
Absolutely.
So how did science help in this case?
So the author of this paper, who happens to be a decision analyst, he meticulously used something called a decision tree to analyze the situation.
A decision tree. What's that?
Yeah, so a decision tree, it's basically a visual tool that helps you to map out all the different possibilities and their consequences. It's like drawing a map of all the possible roads you could take.
Okay.
So he used a decision tree to figure out the best course of action.
Oh, wow. So he used a decision tree to figure out the best course of action for his wife and baby.
For his wife and baby.
That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, he carefully considered the different options, turning the baby or not, and all of the potential outcomes. He even went a step further, and he questioned the doctor's confidence in the procedure. He said, well, what's the probability that this is actually going to work? This allowed him to account for any uncertainties and make a more informed decision.
That's amazing. I like that he didn't just blindly accept what the doctor was recommending, but he used this scientific approach to really assess, okay, what are the options here, and make the decision himself.
Yeah.
But it wasn't all about just crunching the numbers. Right?
No, that's an excellent point. His wife also played a crucial role in the decision-making process.
Okay.
While he was analyzing all the data, she was doing her own research. She was thinking about her values.
So it was a collaborative effort, combining his analytical approach, but also her preferences and really coming together. What a great example of how science and intuition can work together.
Yeah, exactly. The decision tree provided this framework for understanding the options, but ultimately the final decision rested on their values and their preferences.
Absolutely. This is a great example of how decision analysis can be helpful in our own personal lives. But what about bigger decisions? Like decisions that affect an entire community?
Yeah. Let's look at how the California Public Utilities Commission used decision analysis to tackle a complex issue.
Okay.
And that issue was electromagnetic fields, or EMFs, from power lines.
EMS.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a bit further for our listeners who might not be familiar?
Sure. So EMFs are these invisible energy waves produced by things like power lines.
Okay.
Back in the 1970s, a study suggested that there might be a connection between living near power lines and an increased risk of childhood leukemia.
Oh, wow.
So this caused a lot of concern, but further research was inconclusive.
So no one could say for sure if EMFs were dangerous, but people were understandably worried. I can see how that would create a really tough decision for the Public Utilities Commission.
Yeah.
Because you have to consider public health,
Right.
but then also the cost of potential solutions.
Absolutely. So they were stuck. You had the residents who wanted the most expensive solution, which was to bury the power lines underground to minimize the EMFs.
Yeah.
And then you had the utility companies who wanted to avoid that cost since, there was no definitive proof of harm.
So how did they decide what to do?
Well, they called in a research team to help them.
This sounds like a job for decision analysis.
Yes.
So what did the researchers do?
So they started by identifying all the different stakeholders who were involved. You had the residents, the utility companies, health officials, and more. And then they carefully analyzed the costs and benefits of each possible option.
Okay.
They took into account things like potential health impacts, property values, even the risk of power outages.
Wow. That's a lot to consider. How do you even begin to compare all those different things?
Well, they used a clever technique called equivalent dollar costs.
Equivalent dollar costs?
Yes.
But
basically, they found a way to express everything in terms of dollar amounts. So health impacts, property values, even the inconvenience of power outages. They put a dollar amount on everything.
okay.
So that allowed them to create a scorecard for each policy option.
Oh, interesting.
And they could see which one had the lowest overall cost.
So they found a common language for comparing apples and oranges.
Exactly.
Okay, so what was the result of all this analysis? What did they end up deciding?
Well, the analysis actually suggested that the most cost-effective option was moderate mitigation measures. So strategies for reducing EMF exposure without resorting to the expensive measure of undergrounding.
So it was a balanced approach that considered both the risks and the costs. What a great example of how decision analysis can be helpful in making those tough choices. But did this make everybody happy? I imagine those residents who really wanted the power lines underground, they might have been disappointed.
You're right. It didn't magically erase all the disagreements, but it did clarify what the core issues were.
Good.
The debate shifted from arguing about, is this dangerous, to a discussion about, okay, well, what values are most important to each stakeholder?
So it comes back to the importance of values in decision making.
Mhm.
Even with all the data in the world, our choices are ultimately shaped by what we believe is important.
Exactly. And understanding that can actually help us to have more productive conversations about, complex issues. It's not always about finding the quote-unquote right answer. It's about finding the solution that aligns with our shared values.
That's a really good point. And this is making me think about my own decision-making process. I'm starting to see how my beliefs and values play a role in everything I do. But what about the role of our brains in all of this? How does the physical structure of our brain affect how we make decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it leads us into the world of neuroscience. So our brains are these incredibly complex organs, and there are specific regions of our brain that play a key role in decision-making.
Okay, that's what I've been waiting for. Let's dive into the brain and see what's going on in there.
So one of the key players in the brain is something called the prefrontal cortex. It's like the CEO of your brain. It's responsible for planning, for reasoning, for making those well-thought-out decisions.
So when I'm debating whether to save money or splurge on that new gadget, that's my prefrontal cortex hard at work.
Exactly. It's trying to weigh the long-term benefits of saving against the immediate gratification of that shiny new toy.
But then there are those times when I just can't resist that impulse buy, even though I know I shouldn't. What's happening then? Is my prefrontal cortex taking a break?
That's when another part of your brain, the limbic system, takes over. This is the emotional center. It's driven by feelings, by immediate rewards. It's the part that says, I want it now.
So it's like a tug of war between logic and emotion. No wonder decision-making can feel so complicated sometimes.
It is a bit of a balancing act, and sometimes understanding this interplay can help us make better choices. If you know you're prone to those impulse purchases, maybe take a moment, pause, let your prefrontal cortex catch up.
That's a great tip. Taking a moment to breathe and think things through can definitely help. But even when we're trying to be rational, aren't there other factors that can influence our decisions?
Absolutely. There's a whole world of cognitive biases that can subtly sway our choices, often without us even realizing it.
Cognitive biases, those sound a little sneaky. Can you give me an example?
Sure. One common bias is called the framing effect. This is the idea that the way information is presented can influence our choices, even if the underlying options are the same.
Okay. That sounds a little manipulative. How does that work in real life?
Imagine you're at the grocery store and you see 2 packages of ground beef.
Okay.
One says 90% lean and the other says 10% fat. Which one sounds healthier?
I'd probably go for the 90% lean. It just sounds better, even though it's the same thing.
Exactly. The framing effect can be used in advertising, in marketing, even in how the news is presented. Being aware of this bias can help us make more objective decisions.
Wow. I'm starting to see how easily we can be swayed by these subtle cues. What other biases should we be aware of?
Another common one is anchoring bias. This is the tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information we receive, even if it's not relevant.
So it's like that first piece of information becomes an anchor that drags our thinking in a certain direction.
Exactly. Let's say you're negotiating the price of a car. If the seller starts with a ridiculously high price, that number might stick in your mind, even if you know it's inflated. It might make you offer more than you would have otherwise.
That's so sneaky. So how do we avoid falling into these bias traps?
One key strategy is to seek out diverse perspectives. Don't just rely on one source of information. Talk to different people, read different articles, try to get a well-rounded view of the situation.
It's like getting a second or third opinion before you make a big decision.
Exactly.
What other strategies can we use?
Another helpful technique is to slow down the decision-making process. Give yourself time to think things through, weigh the pros and cons, consider the potential consequences.
Sometimes I rush into decisions, especially when I'm feeling excited or pressured. Taking a step back can make a big difference.
Absolutely. It allows your prefrontal cortex, that logical part of your brain, to catch up and guide you towards a more rational choice.
We've been talking a lot about the logical side of decision-making. But what about intuition? Does that play a role too?
Intuition is a fascinating aspect of decision-making. It's often dismissed as just a gut feeling, but research suggests it's actually based on a vast amount of experience and knowledge that our brains have processed subconsciously.
So it's not just a random hunch, there's actually a lot going on behind the scenes.
Exactly. Our brains are constantly picking up on patterns, making connections, even when we're not aware of it. Sometimes those insights emerge as a gut feeling that can guide our decisions.
But how do we know when to trust our intuition? It can't always be right.
That's a great question. Intuition tends to be more reliable in areas where we have a lot of experience. A seasoned doctor, for example, might have a strong intuitive sense about a patient's diagnosis based on years of seeing similar cases.
So it's like our intuition is honed through practice and experience. Does that mean everyone's intuition is equally trustworthy?
Not necessarily. The accuracy of our intuition also depends on how well we understand the situation and how aligned it is with our values. If your gut feeling is telling you to do something that goes against your core beliefs, it's probably worth examining that feeling a little more closely.
So it's not about blindly following our intuition. It's about integrating it with our logical thinking and our values.
Precisely. And as we learn more about how our brains work, we can develop strategies to make our intuition even more reliable.
This whole conversation has been incredibly insightful. I'm starting to see decision-making in a whole new light. But it also feels a bit overwhelming. There's so much to consider.
I understand. Decision-making can be complex, but the good news is that our brains are incredibly adaptable. We can actually train ourselves to become better decision makers.
That's encouraging. So we're not just stuck with the decision-making habits we've always had.
Not at all. There are techniques we can use to strengthen our prefrontal cortex, improve our emotional regulation, and reduce the influence of biases.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are some of these brain-boosting techniques?
One powerful tool is mindfulness.
Mindfulness. Isn't that about like meditation and relaxation?
It is, but it's also about becoming more aware of our thoughts and feelings in the present moment without judgment.
So it's like hitting the pause button on our busy minds and just observing what's happening.
Exactly. And by practicing mindfulness, we can gain better control over our impulsive reactions and make more intentional choices.
That sounds helpful, especially when I'm feeling stressed or overwhelmed.
It can make a big difference. Mindfulness has actually been shown to improve a range of cognitive functions, like attention and emotional regulation, which are essential for effective decision-making.
So it's like giving our brains a mental workout to become more focused and resilient.
Precisely. And another powerful technique is metacognition.
Metacognition. That sounds complicated.
It's actually quite simple. It just means thinking about thinking.
Okay, that makes more sense. But how does thinking about thinking help us make better decisions?
It's about becoming aware of our own thought processes, identifying our biases, and questioning our assumptions.
So it's like becoming a detective of our own minds, trying to figure out how we tick.
Exactly. And by developing this metacognitive awareness, we can become more conscious of the mental shortcuts we take and the patterns that lead to biased decisions.
This reminds me of that saying, know thyself. It's like we need to understand our own minds before we can truly make informed choices.
Brilliant connection. By reflecting on our choices, both good and bad, we can learn from our mistakes and identify our blind spots.
This is making me realize that better decision-making isn't just about learning new strategies. It's also about cultivating self-awareness and a willingness to learn from our experiences.
Well said. And as we become more aware of our own decision-making processes, we can start to see how they play out in the world around us, particularly in group settings.
That's an interesting point. Do groups face the same kinds of biases and challenges that individuals do?
Absolutely. Think about a team at work trying to decide on a new project.
Okay, I can see how biases might creep in there.
Right, they might fall prey to groupthink, where everyone goes along with the dominant opinion without questioning it. Or they might make decisions based on emotions rather than facts.
So how do we improve decision-making in groups? Is it just about getting everyone to practice mindfulness and metacognition?
That's a great start, but there are also some strategies specifically for group settings.
I'm all ears. Tell me more.
One key principle is fostering diversity of thought.
Diversity of thought. How does that work?
It's about bringing together people with different backgrounds, perspectives, and expertise.
So instead of having a room full of people who all think alike, you want a mix of different viewpoints.
Exactly. When you have a diverse group, you're more likely to challenge assumptions, uncover hidden biases, and come up with more creative solutions.
That makes sense. It's like looking at a problem from all angles instead of just seeing it from one perspective.
Precisely. And it's not just about having diverse voices in the room. It's also about creating a culture where people feel comfortable speaking up and sharing their ideas, even if they're different from the majority.
So it's about creating a safe space for open and honest discussion.
Absolutely. And it's also important to have structured processes that guide group decision-making.
Like what kinds of processes?
Things like clearly defining roles and responsibilities, setting ground rules for communication, and using tools like decision matrices or voting systems.
So it's about providing a framework that helps the group stay focused and make decisions in a fair and transparent way.
Exactly. And this brings us to another important aspect of decision-making, both individually and collectively: responsibility.
Responsibility. How does that factor into the equation?
It's about recognizing that our decisions have consequences, not just for ourselves, but also for others and for the world around us.
So it's not just about making the decision that's best for me personally. It's about considering the broader impact.
Exactly. And this sense of responsibility can be a powerful motivator for making more ethical and sustainable decisions.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to the complexity and importance of decision-making.
It's been my pleasure to explore this fascinating topic with you. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final thought.
I'm all ears.
Even with all the knowledge and techniques we've discussed, sometimes the best decisions are the ones that align with our intuition and our values.
That's a great reminder. It's about finding that balance between the head and the heart, the logical and the intuitive.
Precisely. And as you continue on your journey of understanding decision-making, remember to embrace the complexity, learn from your experiences, and trust that you have the capacity to make choices that are both wise and fulfilling.
Well said. This deep dive has been an incredible journey, and I'm feeling much more equipped to navigate the decisions that lie ahead. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the science of decision-making. We'll see you next time, Deep Divers.